real useful. So the slide background, actually, I gave this lecture at the National Hospice and Palliative Care Foundation's annual event. So I just left my same background up. So this lecture was given at a national level and was well received, and it really applies to all of us. Although I developed it specifically for healthcare providers, it's applicable to all of us. So. These are lots of very boring things about me. So I speak nationally as well as in our community about end-of-life planning and issues. I'm also the author of the book, It's Okay to Die, which my husband will have for sale in the back. It's an end-of-life planning guide. Chris says we're going to give him one to you, so you'll be receiving a complimentary copy this evening. Some of the things I refer to in here do relate back to our website. We have some free downloads, and I have some resources to give you that you'll be able to share in the community as you help other people come to having a greater awareness about end-of-life issues and how we would make decisions for someone that we cared about. Oh wow, let's jump it on. So the main question of the night is this. Please raise your hand if you've ever had to make a medical decision for someone else. Okay, one. You did too, right? 2, 3. So raise your hand if it was hard. Why was it hard?
Well, one that I had to make was difficult. It was a medical decision. It wasn't life or that one wasn't life or death. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to mention two. And that was when my wife was delivering our son, which was her second pregnancy. Mm-hmm. She had lost the first one rather late. I literally had the clipboard and pen in my hand to authorize a C-section. She had not discussed that with her doctor. It was a very difficult decision to make. Fortunately for me, that was taken out of my hands.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because the doctor suddenly said, "Oh, I see the head. We can deliver vaginally." So,
tell me, from an ethical or psychological perspective, why that was feeling difficult for you.
Because I felt like it really should be her decision. It's her body, it's right. Her choice, her decision to make. So that one was very difficult. The second one involved my father and my father's death. It was very easy because I had decided at the time that I took over their finances when they were becoming quite elderly, mm-hmm. that we needed to have a family meeting and talk about all the issues, and that included advance directives. So when he passed away, his wishes were very clear. It was just a matter of the family informing the doctors of what
Correct.
He wanted.
Yes, and so that is the gold standard. The gold standard is that plans have been made and your family have heard it from you or from the horse's mouth. This is the way to give people, surrogate decision makers, peace at the end of life. Thank you. Those are perfect, juxtaposed expectations. So I have 2 examples I'd like to share with you. The first one is a professional story. Okay, so this little cute guy, he's very cute. See, he's wrinkling his nose. And this was not him actually, but a photo that looked very similar to him. This gentleman was 105 years old, and he was sent to the emergency department from a local nursing home. Apparently, right after lunch, he had grabbed his chest and yelled out, "I'm having a heart attack," and then continued to eat his lunch. So dutifully, the nurses did what should be required of them. They called 911, who had to take the man's lunch tray from him and bring him to the emergency department. When he arrived, he was smiling like this with his nose wrinkled. He was both blind and deaf. He couldn't hear me or see me, but he was smiling. So I imagine he had an interesting personality earlier in life. So because he could not hear or see me, I could not communicate with him, right? So I didn't know what was going on other than he yelled out, "I'm having a heart attack." I looked at his EKG. There was no evidence of a heart attack. So I thought, well, we'll send some blood work and just see what happens. And I really expected everything to be normal. Well, during the time of waiting, his 85-year-old son came to join him in the emergency department. And so the blood work came back showing that he had indeed had a heart attack. It was positive. The nurse called me and said, "Your patient in room 47 did have a heart attack." And so I went in because if his son hadn't showed up, I thought, well, how do we make this decision? Because we typically don't offer a very aggressive intervention for someone who's 105. But his son was there, and his son could hear me and see me. And so I explained the situation. Your father's had a heart attack. He's not in any discomfort right now. In fact, he's cute and smiling. And I explained that we usually don't recommend aggressive intervention, but the decision needed to be based on what the patient's desires would be. And so my question was, have you ever spoken with your father about a living will or advance directive, whether he would want aggressive intervention or not? And he said no. And then finally he said, I went on, and I was thinking, you're 85 and he's 105 and you've never had this conversation? And he said, Doctor, are you trying to talk about dying or something? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you've never talked about anything like that. You just do what you think you ought to do. Well, that is not the proper position for surrogate decision making. The default should not be back to the medical system, because I'll tell you, most doctors aren't like me. They're not going to ask you. They're just going to take you and do to you what we do. That's the way we're trained. We're interveners, okay? Now the system's changing. We're trying to be more patient-centered. But by and large, if you show up in the ER, things will get done to you. We'll ask questions later. So that's my professional story. Next is my personal story. This is a photo of me holding my grandmother's hand 3 minutes after she took her final breath in this life. When I was writing the book, I had studied about the natural patterns that occur at the end of life. And I wrote a chapter explaining that pattern. At the end of that chapter, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I thought, I just wrote about my grandmother. The pattern I just wrote about fits her. And I have not had this conversation with her. I haven't prepared her. She doesn't have a living will. So I should not be a hypocrite and teach this stuff without preparing my own family. So I thought, well, I'm off work. I'll call my grandmother and go see her. She lives in Tuscaloosa. I live north of Birmingham on a farm and drive up to work here. So I called her up and I said, Granny, I'm going to come and see you this afternoon and we're going to do a living will. And she said, that's a good idea. All right. So I got in the car and printed off the Alabama State Living Will and put it in the front seat and started driving to Tuscaloosa. Now here's how I knew she was at the end of life. She was an 86-year-old independent living female. She still lived in her own home. But in the last 3 months, her health had begun to change. She was falling. She had lost 20 pounds. She was not eating. She was sleeping a lot. She was starting to give things away. Okay? People begin to shed the things that make them who they are. She'd even written on a little sewing machine for Susie, and she was writing people's names on pictures on the back of the wall. So the pattern was there. I didn't recognize it. I'm the doctor. Doctors don't necessarily recognize this, okay? We're not trained to think this way, unfortunately. Times are changing. So as I'm driving to Tuscaloosa, I got a phone call from my cousin who lives across the street. My cousin said, Monica, she's fallen again, and she's asking for you. And I said, was she okay? What's going on? And she said, Granny said she's okay. She said, drive faster. So I did. Halfway down the road further, I got the second phone call. Granny's unresponsive. I'm calling 911. So I drove faster, and I beat the paramedics to her house. And I went in and I saw my granny in a way I had never seen her before. She'd always been strong, the matriarch who told us what to do. And there she was weak and sweaty and pale and frail. And she reached out her hand to me when I walked in the door, and there were people filling the room, family and neighbors. And she said, Monica, I don't want to go back to the hospital. If the Lord's ready for me, I'm ready to go. That's a big burden. I mean, we haven't even had this conversation, and she's telling me that she's dying, or she perceives that, right? So the room filled with my family, and they were all quiet, staring at us. I'm the family doctor, so I took on the role of helping, knowing what to do. And I said, Granny, I am so sorry. I failed you because I didn't even realize that this is where you were. I mean, I just now today was going to come and talk about this, not to have it happen. I didn't sign up for hospice. I don't have a resource for you to just stay at home. And in our family here, they're not going to let us just do that. So let's go to the hospital, and I promise I'll bring you home as soon as I can. And she said, okay. But remember, I had come to have a conversation, and I knew that time was precious, and I needed to have this conversation before we got any further downstream in healthcare. So I stood up and became the doctor rather than the granddaughter, and I gathered my family and I said, I'm going to ask Granny some questions, and you need to hear what she says because we have to honor her wishes. And so hard to ask your loved one this. Granny, when your heart stops, do you want us to do chest compressions on you that will break your ribs? Or do you want us to let you go? And she said, I don't want any of that. The paramedics were standing there too. Granny, when you stop breathing, not if, when any of us stop breathing, do you want us to put a tube in you to breathe for you? And she said, no, I'm okay to go, Monica. I looked at my family and their eyes were this big. And I said, did you hear that? We have to honor that. And then she said, Monica, I want you to talk to the doctors for me. You know what I want. So in that moment, I became her healthcare decision maker officially. And my family heard it, and they honored that. And I am so glad we had this conversation because we went to the hospital and we were admitted. And over the next 18 hours, my granny died in my arms. And it was one of the most beautiful and painful experiences of my life. But I got to hold her hand and say, thank you, I love you, and goodbye. It was precious. It was a sacred experience. That would have never happened in the intensive care unit with a breathing tube sticking out of her. Even my illiterate uncle held her and wept over her and gave her permission to go. The nurse caring for us came into the room and said, I have never seen anything like this. And I, the doctor, said, neither have I, but I think this is the way it's supposed to be. So my grandmother changed my life. I practice medicine differently now. I want to know what people have said, what they desire for their health care. And when they don't know, it's my job to support you, the person having to make the best decision for someone that you love. So this is personal for me. It's personal. So next slide. So this was just on a blog I wrote. And just very generically, we see this all the time. Someone comes into the emergency department, Mama. Mama's unresponsive. Daughter is the healthcare proxy and has no clue what Mama would have wanted. So how do we help people who are stuck in this really difficult situation? You are going to be there one day yourself, or a friend of yours is going to be stuck in this situation, okay? And then it's so hard because the doctor or healthcare provider caring for the loved one is supposed to help you, okay, and say, I know it's hard, but can you think about what your loved one would have wanted? But here's the way it really works out. The minute a doctor says, what should we do? You can't think about that person lying in the bed. Guilt and fear and love and all of your own stuff comes up and gets tangled up right in front of you in a big cloud. You can't get through all your own stuff. You can't remove that and be objective about what your loved one would have wanted. So it's very complicated. It's a very tangled web. But there is a way out, and we'll be talking about that tonight. Next. So this is an outline. We'll just get to it. All right, we'll get to these pieces as we go. Next. So the first question is, when medically is a surrogate decision maker needed? There actually is a place in medicine where the doctor can say, Mrs. Thomas no longer has decision capacity. I need to find her spouse or someone that she has previously designated. So let's figure out how that is the case. Next. So depending on what kind of physician you are, there are quite a few different tools to help you to discover whether your patient still has the mental capacity to make their own decision or not. And a lot of them are about 20 minutes long, but I'm an ER doctor and I don't have 20 minutes to make a decision. So this is one of the quick and easy ones we use in medicine. It's called a curves mnemonic. So just really rapidly, these 4 first questions tell me whether the patient can make their own decision or not. And the answer to all of the first 4 questions has to be yes for me to say, Mrs. Thomas, I'm going to talk to you because you're able to make your own decisions. So So number one, can the patient choose and communicate their choice? Are they able to express it? Remember, my deaf man and blind could neither hear nor see, so he could not hear what I was trying to tell him, nor could he communicate a choice. So the answer was no for him. The second is, does the patient understand the risks, benefits, and consequences and alternatives to whatever it is I'm offering? Can they understand that? Are they clear enough to do so? The third is the patient reasonable? Are they acting reasonably? Are they able to provide a reason and rationale for their particular choice? And then the fourth question, this is sometimes hard, is do you think what they're saying is consistent with the known values of that patient? That might be a little challenging if I'm the doctor and the patient is of a different culture. I'm not really sure that I would know objectively what their value set is. But that's the screening tool. So if I think the answer to all that is yes, then I'm going to talk to the patient. The family needs to stand back. It's not about them. It's about the patient when it can be. Next, sir. So how often is a surrogate decision maker needed? And this is going to be kind of quick serial. So go down, click 3 times, please. Okay. And 2 more times. Perfect. Okay. So multiple choice question for you guys. What percentage of the total population, what percentage of us in this room who will be unable to make our own medical decision at the end of life? Is it, do you think 25% of us will be unable to do so, 35 or 50%, or none of the above? So let's take a poll. Who thinks 25% of us will be unable to make our own decision? 35? Okay, 2. 50? How about none of the above? And what do you guys think? What do you think?
I think it's much higher.
Much higher. Okay, so 2 more clicks, sir. According to the National Institutes of Health, it is 50%. But I will tell you that almost all of us think it's much higher. Before I knew the statistic, I thought it was about 75%, based on people who come in the ER, they're unresponsive at the end of life. That's who I get, right? But it's 50%, so that means that 50% of us, on average, will be unable to make a decision for ourselves at the end of life. If that's you, do you know who's making the decision for you, and have they heard from you what they want or do not want? Next. So let's talk about the psychosocial pressures that exist for the surrogate decision maker. Next, sir. Because they are many and they are painful. So the word ouch is very appropriate. Next. So this is my quote. Families make decisions usually out of guilt and fear and love. But I'll tell you that ethically or spiritually, if you choose to see it this way, love is really the only correct position from which we should make decisions for another. Next.
I have a question.
Yes.
Monica. So my daughter lives close to me. We talk about this stuff. She absolutely knows what my position is, and she is I've got the durable power of attorney.
Yes.
My son lives on the other side of the country. Now, I really don't know what his reaction would be, but I've certainly heard this happen in other families. So something's happening. My daughter is fully prepared to say, pull the plug.
Okay.
My son walks in and says, what do you mean you're going to pull the plug on my mother? How does that play out in this stuff?
Is she the first decision maker and priority that's written on your living will?
I have a durable power of attorney for health on her.
Is he listed?
As second, yeah.
Second. So only when she is unavailable or incapacitated can he make the decision.
Okay.
And so I do recommend this for those of you who have a healthcare or durable power of attorney who's identified surrogate decision makers. You need to list people in order of who can make the best decision for you. I strongly discourage having joint decision makers. Oh, my children, they'll decide together. I'm sorry, that's crap. Fighting starts when 2 people have opposing opinions and they've been given equal power. So you really should frankly list 3 people in order of who's most likely to make the decision you've discussed. And sometimes it's not your family. Sometimes it's your neighbor
So
or the
you can
postman.
give somebody outside your family that power.
Yeah, and
Okay.
frankly, there are in some families, I encourage it to be a non-family member. Okay. So I actually do know someone who they gave her their postman or something. They said, my postman's known me for 30 years. He was listed number 3 on their list. Okay, so if love is the correct position for surrogate decision making, because real love falls under this definition. I'm going to read the main bullet points for you. This is from a religious site, but it's objective and applies to us all. Love is the commitment of my will to your needs and best interests regardless of the cost. Okay, so this is really about taking myself out of the equation and focusing on you. Next, sir. Again, I think we're going backwards. Oops,
Oh yeah,
wrong way.
got my finger on the wrong arrow.
Good. And then keep going. Okay, good. So according to the medical literature, this is some interesting statistics about healthcare proxies. So in this one specific review study, they reviewed 40 studies that included almost 2,500 surrogates or people who had to make a medical decision. 50% of the time, this is family members. You know, that usually is the case. At least 1/3 of the people who had to make a medical decision for another felt a huge, significant decision burden. And by decision burden, the study said this was stress, guilt, PTSD, which may last months to years. And I will tell you, in my experience, for some people, it lasts decades. I have had people read our book and come back and tell me that for 20 years, I have suffered wondering whether I made the right decision for my mother or not. So this is something not easily shed in our lifetimes. That's why it's so important that we do this well. Next. 2 quotes. I wouldn't wish being a surrogate on my worst enemy, and I felt like I was the jury to sentence to death the person I love most in the world. Those are common sentiments for people who felt a huge negative decision burden when making a decision for another. Next. So 1/3, the statistics aren't good, guys. The other 1/3 felt moderate distress. So moderate stress, moderate guilt, moderate PTSD. Less than 10% of people had a positive experience. And for those 10% of people, it's those who had that conversation upstream in healthcare. Okay. So next. These are some quotes from people who had a positive experience. I thank God Mom and Dad had a living will made. I'm glad that I was not the person who had to make the decision. My loved one made it for me. They made it themselves. And that's why I basically have no regrets. I was carrying out her wishes. Now this is a photograph of my husband's parents' headstone. Okay? Chris in the back. I'm going to interview him here. You want to come forward so people can hear you, or you're loud? So Chris experienced firsthand, both of his parents are dead, of course, here. He experienced firsthand a positive and a negative effects of surrogate decision making for his family. So Chris, what were the effects of decision making on you regarding your father? And you can just briefly tell the story.
My father had a heart attack. He was 88 years old, and he had been healthy, completely all there. And then he went on a vacation, and while he was on vacation, had a heart attack. So we were basically told, well, you have 2 options. You can go, he needs triple bypass surgery, which he may or may not survive, or he can be on medications and probably has less than a year to live. And because he had been completely normal and active and still played golf, of course we wanted to do everything possible, and we opted for surgery, which turned into an utter disaster because he became ventilator dependent, multiple infections. He was in the hospital literally 4 straight months, was transferred back home to San Diego, in and out of a hospital bed. 13 months after the surgery, he had a stroke and died. So in my father's case, we desperately wanted to keep him because the day before he was A-OK, and then suddenly he had had a heart attack, and we of course rolled the dice.
How did you feel from all those decisions that you made and the poor outcome?
Well, luckily,
what was the effect on you personally?
well, he was conscious and was awake, and we had a family discussion, and basically he kind of turned it over to us, and I was a fighter. It's like, well, let's go for the surgery and get you back in the golf course.
By the way, that's the common American thing is a fighter. We're all fighters. Everybody in America wants to beat the odds. So there you go.
And remember, my dad was 88 years old, so he was very elderly. You want to talk about after the fact?
Right. So after the fact, you
Oh.
felt like
I was
related.
I was very angry because he had complications and spent a year basically getting better and had never complained, fought off every infection. They advised he had to have his sternum removed because of MRSA, and he said no, and he beat that. He literally bounced back, and then just as he was up and about and talking, and he had regained swallowing function and could speak, then he had the double stroke and passed away. So I was very angry, and I was angry because in hindsight, I wish Medicare had said no. I wish the doctors had said, well, if he was 10 years younger, we'd advise it. We don't advise it. Just take what time you have left and enjoy it. Because he would have been somewhat debilitated, but he still would have had his faculties. He still could have enjoyed Christmas and Thanksgiving, and then we would have had a finite time. So in hindsight, I'd never, ever, ever do that again, and would never advise anybody of that because the risks were too great. Take what you've got left versus roll the dice and potentially make it worse. He was worse after the operation by far, and the effect on the family. I was flying back and forth from Mobile while she was in medical school to San Diego, and before that was Utah. And my mother was by his bedside, literally pretty much chained there for 13 months. It's very difficult. So I severe regret after.
Severe regret. So with your dad, big regret. Very negative. You have PTSD from it, so you follow that.
I was angry at God and
You were angry for years.
angry at the doctors.
Until we wrote the book and he was able
Yeah.
to sublimate that energy, he remained angry. So then your mother was a different story. She lived with us and we cared for her and she had a slow decline. So tell us, because we made the decisions for her, tell us the effects of those decisions on you.
Right, and this is before the book, before Monica had basically a crisis of medical practice. Conscience medical practice. We had moved up to Huntsville from where we lived to get close to the hospital and get the kids in the schools up here. And my mother was getting older and older and moved in with us. And she was in her late 80s, and she had started to have a slow decline. She had problems tripping and falling. We had 2 or 3 incidents. We had to take her to the emergency room. She was starting to lose her short-term memory. Towards the end of her life, she was no longer herself. She could remember growing up in Canada on the farm, and she knew us, but what happened, 30 minutes ago, every day was a new day. And she was getting more frequently sicker. And so as we had decided to move back to the farm, she coincidentally went into the hospital, and her doctor basically said she really shouldn't go home. We had a morning and evening nurse care. I was taking care of her. And then when she went into the hospital, the doctor said she really needs to go into a nursing home. So it happened to be when we were moving down south again, we moved her into a nursing home in Huntsville. And that's where she spent the last 6 weeks of her life. And we had had a discussion, and we were really debating, well, when should we stop putting her through this? The next time she gets sick, maybe we should just call in hospice, keep her comfortable, and let nature take its course. And then she got to the point where she was no longer ambulatory. The last week of her life, she wasn't speaking. No explanation, she just stopped talking. And then the night of her passing, and we'd pretty much decided the next time there was something major, we would just try to keep her comfortable. Well, she's in the nursing home, and then we get a call, and coincidentally, Monica had fallen. She was up at our house here in Huntsville, and had fallen down the stairs and split the back of her scalp open, and had driven herself to the emergency room. I gotta get a piece of gum going here or something. And so while I'm racing, I called the babysitter, and she came over. It's about 11 o'clock at night. And I was racing up the back way from Blount County to Huntsville. And Monica got the call first from the nursing home. The nurse called and said, your mother-in-law is having trouble breathing. She's basically in respiratory distress. What do you want us to do? And so Monica called me. This was back before Verizon had great coverage all over. I hit a good spot and called the nursing home in Huntsville, and then I'm going north, and they're over here. And my wife's, I don't know if she's had a brain bleed or a, skull fracture. I don't know what's going on. And the nurse gave me the story and said we tried to put O2 on her up the nose, the little nasal cannula. She refused that and told us, stop torturing me, it's my time to go. And she hadn't said a word in 7 days. And so I told the nurse, because we had already thought kind of this through, I said, well, I think we should honor my mom's wishes. Don't send her to the hospital. Keep her comfortable and contact the medical the doctor for the nursing home. I want her to be comfortable, and if you can give her something to relax her, to calm her, let's do that. And I said, I've got to go up to the ER and get my wife, and then as soon as I get that, I'll race back down. Make a long story short, I got to the hospital. She was actually ready to go. It was just a laceration. I take her back to our house. I get a call on the way there. You need to get down here. Your mom's not doing well. I tuck her into bed, and literally walking out the door of the house here, and I get a call that my mom had passed away. So I had to make the decision, call 911, take her to the hospital, probably intubate her, possibly put her on a vent. Then as she become vent dependent, it was a relatively easy decision because my mom was no longer my mom. She was no longer able to do what she wanted to do. And as I write the book, I have a chapter about this. If my mom could have communicated at the end what she would have wanted in the nursing home situation, she would have said, wheel me the hell out of here and roll me in front of a bus. Because that
Was that kind of like?
yeah, and so I had a real good understanding of, what my mom would have wanted and she would not have wanted. Like, I don't think any of us would want to, have an ending like that. So it was a lot easier to say, let's not do everything. Because I'm sure that we could have sent her to the hospital. They could have probably got her through it. But for what purpose? And so I felt much more, I've never had a second thought. I was very comfortable. She passed, and thank God she had said what she said to the nurse, stop torturing me, it's my time to go. If I was to reverse that, she would have haunted me, or, when I hopefully meet up with her, she'd say, why did you put me through that longer than I had to?
So
Is that what you want?
good example of feeling terrible after being a decision maker and
completely.
feeling pretty okay. Like we did the right thing. Never a second thought. Always had peace about taking care of Chris's mom. All right, so next slide. Let's talk about ethical ways, ethically speaking, about how we should make a decision for another. And so some of this is from medical literature, but when I talk to you about it, it's going to make sense. We're going to make it common language. The first and most common position that we put a surrogate decision maker in is this. We try to say, Carol, what do you think that your mother would have wanted? Okay, so that's called substituted judgment. You're substituting your judgment for what you think your mom would have wanted. So that's an attempt at autonomy, an attempt at honoring what that person would have expressed could they had expressed it themselves. But one of the problems is that you got to know the person well enough to make this decision. And most of the medical literature says even knowing them really good doesn't always mean that our decision for them is going to match. So many studies illustrate the following: that neither healthcare providers nor surrogates are good at knowing and predicting patient preferences, which is absolutely a fantastic reason that you need to make your own decisions and do a living will in advance. Next. So substituted judgment, this common ideal, is often inconsistent with patient preferences. Even in the face of very obvious things like the doctor saying, I don't think she's going to make it off the ventilator, it's a poor prognosis. What happens still is that person stuck in the decision-making position will get caught up in guilt and fear and love. And in the minute they go, doctor, do everything to save mama, because it becomes about them not about the patient. So this is a great ideal. We rarely accomplish it. The second decision-making pattern is best interest. What would be in the best interest of your mama? So let's just forget about you, Carol. What's the best interest of your mom? And so this is based on a lot of evidence type things, like what's the clinical prognosis? How does the doctor think she's going to do? What's the life expectancy? What's the risk and benefit? Like with Chris's dad, what's the risk of this surgery? And then in best interest, we want you to make the decision that you think a reasonable adult would make for your mom. Reasonable adult. Next. Well, the issue with best interest is this. The best interest model is based on community norms. So you guys are familiar with the bell curve, right? So if you live under the thick part of the bell curve, the normal community mindset might apply to you. Okay, if you're just an average person in the community, Carol, which we know you're not, you're unique, right? Your decision might fit the cultural norms of the community for best interest. But what if your loved one lived under the thin part of the bell curve, right? So raise your hand if you live under the thin part of the bell curve, right? So I do too. We live on a farm. I don't watch TV. I read a book about death. I'm pretty weird, okay? So my best interest probably is not going to be the average community norm. I might not want aggressive intervention when other people would say, yeah, of course we would do that. It's the community norm. So this doesn't take into account those people who don't live like the common community member. The other problem is that it's limited because it doesn't consider the context of the individual, your mama, and her relationships to you. There are many people who keep mama alive in a vegetative state because it brings the family together. And that's the reason that decision is made. So the question is, is that ethically appropriate or not? Sometimes it might be. It might be what brings peace and unity to the family. So there's some exceptions to this. The next approach, which I kind of like, because I like storytelling, is the narrative approach, where you figure out the person's life story. Carol, let's think about your mama's life story, and let her life story guide us into what kind of decision we would make or not make next. But the problem might be this. What if Carol's version of Mama's life story is very different than Carol's brother's story, right? How would the healthcare provider make a recommendation? Because Carol says Mom was peace-loving and patient and kind and just was free and wanted to let things go. And Carol's brother says Mom's a fighter. She wants everything under the sun, right? So which narrative do we take? Well, the real answer to this is write your own narrative. Again, telling your own story. So this is a photo provided by a friend of mine. I call her my adopted online Jewish mother. She writes for me. And I'm from the Christian faith tradition, but she's an atheist Jew, so we have very different backgrounds. She has listed me as one of her surrogate decision makers. So how would I make a decision for Rhea? So fortunately, I said, Rhea, please write your life story. So she writes about her family's struggle to immigrate and what they did and didn't do and how they suffered. And this is a photo of one of her family relics. So I know a whole lot about her life story because she wrote it. So I can refer to her voice as a reference for what we should do or not do next. Next. So of those that I just presented, which do you like best? Any opinions? The last one, the narrative. I like the narrative a lot. Anybody else? Which one do you like best?
I think I like the narrative, but I really like the idea that everybody make their own decisions clear.
Correct. Yes. So I agree with you. So I created a tool that does exactly that. Next. So, and this is, I was quoting Einstein, none of those have been proven in and of themselves to give much effect. So let's stop doing those and let's do something completely different, okay? Next, please. So again, one more. So the tool I've created, and we got a free sample for you today. It can be freely reproduced for your use or people in your congregation or family, friends, etc. Should anyone ever reach this. It's called Fierro's 4, and it combines both the narrative approach and the idea of substitute judgment. I agree with you. I think those are the two highest ethical principles from which to make these decisions. So next. So this is a photo of a mean, I know you were like, your name's Murphy. Where'd Fierro come from? This is a photo of Dr. Damon Fierro. He is a colleague of mine in the emergency room, and I named this tool after him because he really created it. And this photo is just proof of his CV, his emotional intelligence. He is the father of 4 girls, and there's only one other man in the entire family other than him, so he has very high emotional intelligence. So his ability to talk with families and patients and bring them together is extraordinary. I'd like to tell you the story that led to this tool. I went to relieve him one day. His shift was over, mine was beginning in the emergency department. And he said, well, I'm going to have to stay a little while because I'm taking care of this family and this patient, and we're going to take him off the ventilator. And I said, okay. I didn't ask him any questions because I had a lot of patients to see. But I did notice that he walked into the room and he sat everyone down and he held their hands as they held this unresponsive patient's hand on the ventilator. They all cried. Dr. Fierro cried. They called in the respiratory therapist. They removed the ventilator, and the patient, within 30 minutes, had a very peaceful dying experience. And he came out, and I said, what did you do in there? And he told me the story. He said, that man walked into the ER, walked in 12 hours ago with the worst headache of his life. We did a CAT scan. It looked normal. He became confused. We did a lumbar puncture and found that he had meningitis. During the admission process, he really became less conscious and then entered a coma. So we put him on life support. Over the next 3 to 4 hours, his brain swelled and he lost all signs of brain life. You really just don't come back from that. And so he went and had an honest conversation with the family. Clinically, he's brain dead. I am so sorry. He was just normal-ish, right? Still sick, but normal 12 hours ago. And I said, how did you talk a family into letting him go when he was just normal 12 hours ago? And he said, I have some things I say, and this is what they are. Next. So for a moment, let us decide. I'm going to walk you through. We're going to decide that you're making a decision for someone that you love. So in your mind, imagine, we're just going to say it's your sister. Your sister has advanced Alzheimer's dementia. She has pneumonia, and her breathing is failing. And so the doctor's asking you, what are we going to do next, right? You're the decision maker. So in this tool, here's what we're going to say. You're not going to decide. You're going to let your sister decide, and this is how. Next. So the first R is reflect. Think back about your sister before she had Alzheimer's. Who she was before she became ill. Next. The second R is to reconstruct her preferences. So you ask questions like, what were her favorite things? Did she like soup or chili? What were her hobbies? Did she like to knit or sew or chop wood? Was she for Alabama, Auburn, or could care less? Right? So what kinds of things did she prefer? Next. The third R is to reconstruct her values. Had she ever seen anyone in this situation before? What was her opinion? Had she discussed her values with you ahead of time to know about what one might want in this situation? Was she religious or non-religious? What were her thoughts about the meaning of life? And next. And number 4 is review the medical options and decide. And this is how you literally, because please notice you've actually forgotten about yourself. You're thinking about your sister. You literally imagine that your sister in her former state is standing here and sees herself in the hospital bed, and you ask your sister in your mind, you see yourself there, what would you want us to do or not do next? So focusing on the patient's life story, mixing it with the idea of autonomy, how to get out of ourselves and focus on the patient and what they would want, and to extract that from their life story is the right way to make a decision. It's the best way and the easiest way and the right way. So next. All right, so we'll end with 2 more stories. Again, just like we started, I have a professional story and I have a personal story about using this tool and how it helped, okay, and simplified things. Next. So the first is a professional story. I had a gentleman come in who was about 50-ish years old, And a year ago, he had been a very successful businessman, and he had been in a car accident and had developed a hemorrhage on the outside of his brain that ultimately left him with the mentality of about a 3-year-old child, and he was completely paralyzed on one side of his body and completely dependent for care, honestly. And so he had been that way for about 6 months. The family had decided to put him back into rehabilitation, hoping to bring him up to a higher function, which was probably overblown dreams, honestly. After 6 months, you're kind of going to be who you are. You are who you're going to be. But in the facility, he actually fell and struck his head. And 10 or 15 minutes later, he was very sleepy and almost unconscious, so he was transferred back to the emergency department. And I went in to see him before any family members had arrived. I did a CAT scan. The bleeding had returned, and it was bigger than the original injury. And one of his pupils had gotten very large, and the other one was small, and that's a sign of impending herniation of the brain, meaning I have to rush him to surgery if we're going to save his life. And so I asked my nurse, is there any family here? And they said, yes, his 18-year-old son. That's the only person available. So his son came in the room, and he carried himself like a much older man. I was very impressed. And I said, sir, do you have any other family here? His wife, is there someone? He said, everyone's out of town for an event. And I said, well, let's talk, but we're going to need to call your mother. And so I said, rapidly, let's discuss this. You're the only adult in the room. I showed him the picture of the brain. I said, look at your father. The 2 choices that have to be made today are, do we rush your father to surgery? And I want you to know that he's not even going to be as good as he was last week. He'll be down a level from what that was. We can save his life if we rush him to surgery, but the question is, what is his quality of life? And the other option is to make him comfortable and let him go. He looked at his feet, and I thought I knew for sure what was about to come out of his mouth. But he said, Doctor, I think we've already done enough to keep my daddy out of heaven. I had never heard adult children say anything like that before. And I said, let's call your mother. So he got on the phone, and I thought he was just going to say, the doctor wants to talk to you, and to hand the phone to me. But he started the conversation. He said, Mom, Dad's got another blood clot on his brain, and the doctor says he either has to go to surgery or he would die, but they would make him comfortable. And I think we should just make him comfortable. Don't you think, Mom? I couldn't believe it. And he handed the phone to me, and she said, yes, we don't want to do anything more. We had contemplated taking him off life support with the original injury because we were so concerned that he would not find his quality of life acceptable. So she said, I know I'm away, and his brother's coming, but our decision is to let him go. So I had prepared to have a peaceful dying experience in the emergency department. But in came his brother, all right? He's the fighter. The brother was the fighter. The brother said, where is the surgeon? Why aren't we going to the operating room? And I said, well, sir, the patient's wife is the decision maker, and their choice is to make him comfortable and let him go. And I gave my best argument. I said, if it was my mother, I would do the same, or my spouse. That would be my choice, and so I support them. But he was really angry, and he was like, no, this is wrong. And so I thought, well, there's only one way out of it. I'm going to have to use this tool on it if there's any hope at all. So this is what I did. I sat him down in the chair, and I said, well, let's think about your brother. It's not about me and you. It's not even really about your wife. It's not about your son. It's about your brother who's here in this bed. And so let's imagine he's going to make this decision. Imagine your brother before his accident a year ago. What kind of man he was. The second R is reconstruct his preferences. I said, so what did your brother like to do? And he said, well, he liked to drive fast cars, and he liked to play golf. And I said, how much of that has he done lately? None. He's not able to do that. The fourth R is reconstruct his values. So, what did he hold sacred? What did he believe about the nature of life and death? And he said, well, he was a strong Christian. He believed in heaven. I said, okay. I said, with that mindset, I want you to imagine your brother, his former self, is standing here in this room and looking at himself in that hospital bed and sees that picture, and he knows how he's been for the last 6 months because it's the way he's going to be for the rest of his life or worse, what would your brother want us to do or not do next? There was a long silence. He rocked back in his chair and he took a deep breath and he said, "Nothing. My brother wouldn't want us to do anything more." And I said, "I thank you, because it's your brother's position that matters." The family that was present held this man's hand, and he had a peaceful dying experience right in the emergency department. It was peaceful and graceful. So that's my professional story. Here's my personal story. My very own cousin. So I'm a redneck, and this is proof of it. This is my cousin and his two sisters. They're hanging out at a bar, drinking some beer. I grew up in Tuscaloosa County. I'm a coal miner's daughter. So this is my cousin. He's my age. We grew up together. He functioned as my brother. I was an only child until I was older, but he was the only person my age that fit the brother profile. So this was about a year ago. They were hanging out at a bar, drinking some beer, having some fun. And this next photo is 2 weeks later. Next photo. My cousin he was young, but he had some health problems. He was on a blood thinner. He had issues with his lungs and some lung damage. He had clots in his lungs. So he had gone over to the casino, had a rowdy night drinking, and had fallen and hit his head and became confused and was acting strange for a couple of days. And then he just fell out in a coma, and so he was rushed to the hospital where they found that he had a massive amount of bleeding on his brain. And he was sent from Tuscaloosa to UAB to the neurosurgeon so they could evacuate the clot. And they were like, "Oh, he's young and healthy, he'll do fine, right? He's 43, he should do okay." Well, he didn't do okay. He never woke up. He had 2 more brain surgeries over the course of a week. He was on every form of life support there is. He had five drips hanging on him to support him. And my family, we're uneducated. I'm the first person to go to college. They didn't quite understand what they were all saying, and they were getting mixed signals. The brain surgeon was using very veiled language about quality of life. Doctors have a hard time calling it like it is. And then the lung doctor was saying, "We're going to win this. We're going to pull him out of this." But the bottom line is that he had no brain activity that was obvious. He wasn't doing anything. The bottom line is that he was probably going to be in a vegetative state with a breathing tube and a feeding tube. So after a week of confusion, my family called me to the hospital and said, "You need to help us because we don't know what's going on and we think he's in worse shape than what they're telling us." So I drove down, and my job was not to tell them what to do. My job was to help them to know what my cousin would have wanted after we had gathered the information. So first of all, it was information gathering. I called the neurosurgeon into the room and I put him on the spot, and neurosurgeons don't like that. And I said, "So, you're about to put a breathing tube in his neck and cut a hole in his stomach for feeding?" And he said, "Yeah, we're going to do that tomorrow." And my family shook. Well, we didn't know that was going to happen next. And he was like, "Well, we're going to talk about it tomorrow." And I said, "Well, hold on, let's just talk about the big picture. He's probably not going to live at all, correct?" And he said, "Yes." My family's eyes were huge. And I said, "And if he does live, what do you think is going to be his quality of life? Is he going to be living in a nursing home requiring 24-hour care to be rolled or moved?" And he said, "Yeah, that's about right." That's not what my family had heard, okay? And I said, "Last thing, if this was you lying here in this bed, we really need to all know. Would you want to continue aggressive therapy, doctor? Or would you want your family to make you comfortable and let you go?" He didn't like to be put on the spot. So he kind of turned red, and some thistles popped out on his forehead. He ground his foot into the ground, but he answered the question. He said, "It would be hard, but I think I would want my family to let me go." My family hadn't heard any of this prior to that moment. And so I said, "Thank you, doctor, for your time. We've got to now talk about my cousin." Next slide. So I sat my family down and I said, "Well, I know you've already heard all that, but in that context, let's talk about Junior." That was his name. Okay. I said, "So really it's not about us, but with that information, we would need to let Junior make this decision. How would we do it?" I said, "Think about Junior 2 weeks ago when you're hanging out at the bar drinking beer. Think about who he was, all right? And then we did the first R. We reflected back about that day. We talked about that actual day. The second R is reconstruct his preferences. What kinds of things did Junior like to do? Well, like any good redneck, he liked to watch football and hunt and drink beer, and that was about it. Okay? Those were his 3 hobbies. And that was quality of life for him. That was his reference point. His favorite things to do and not much else. He would never be doing those 3 favorite things again, okay, if he lived. Reconstruct his values. Does Junior have any beliefs about death? Well, we're not religious people. He doesn't believe anything. Take it into context. The fourth is review medical options and decide. So I said, let's just imagine for a minute that Junior heard all that he'll never hunt and shoot and drink beer and watch football games again. And the doctor's given these options. Continue aggressive care or let him go comfortably. What would Junior want us to do or not do next? Now, these people don't mince words, so his sister would say, get me the hell out of here. That's what he said. She said he would say, get me the hell out of here. Why have y'all done all this to begin with? And I said, well, that's probably our answer. So we called in the doctors, and my family told them what they thought Junior would have wanted. The next day was the Super Bowl. And so the palliative care team came in, and they slowly and gently withdrew care. And my cousin Junior died at the end of the Super Bowl game, just as he would have wanted. Right. So that's my personal story. Next. And one more. So these are some of the desired outcomes of really good surrogate decision making. Ultimately, and we're all going to die, good surrogate decision making gives us a good death. One of the definitions of a good death includes knowing and honoring the wishes of the one who's dying. And so if there's a way to better know them or to better honor them, to that extent we give people a good death, a good dying experience. Next, sir. And so finally, these are the desired outcomes. This is what we hope for if you're good at making a medical decision for another. We're going to increase respect for the person's beliefs and values. But again, it's not about me, not about my beliefs and values, it's about theirs. How do we generate respect and focus on that? Number 2, this kind of tool will increase the likelihood that decisions are made are focused on the values of that person. Not my values, but their values. Number 3, it decreases this guilt burden that occurs for the surrogate decision maker. It really relieves that. We don't want you struggling for 20 years about the rightness or wrongness of the decision you made for someone you love. We want you to have peace to the extent it's possible. Peace of mind. And next one, sir. That, my friends, is relief for the surrogate decision maker. So this concludes my very long lecture. I'm open for discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thunderous applause from a small audience.
Yay! I like applause. So. Or you could toss red tomatoes at me. I'm good with that too.
You've spoken several times about the person who's dying being unconscious.
Yes. If they're conscious, they can tell us what we want, right? If you're conscious and the doctor uses a screening tool and realizes that you're within your right state of mind, then you guide us. But even like Chris said, his mom was fairly nonverbal the last 7 days of life. One of the signs of dying is that people stop talking. And so, ultimately, you're all probably going to be nonverbal at the close to the very end. And medical decisions can occur in that window. And so people need to know your healthcare wishes, to honor them, and have had a discussion so that if they're the surrogate decision maker, they can focus on what you would want or not want. Most people want to die at home. 90% of Americans at the end of a long life or terminal illness want to take their last breath in their very own home. And so is your family going to allow you to stay home for that? They better have heard it from you.
Have you used this tool kind of in the past tense? Here's somebody who made that decision. It's feeling all kinds of, I'm thinking of my nephew related
Yes.
to my sister. And does it seem to work?
Well, I haven't purposefully used it retrospectively, except I will tell you this. It's included in the chapter in our book about surrogate decision making. And so when people have read the book, they have told me, and this was not I intended for people to plan the future. A good sizable minority of people have said, this gave me peace about what I did or did not do to this person 20 years ago. So there was retroactive peace about the decision process. And it probably came from reading and thinking about this tool and getting outside of our own guilt and decision burden that came with that decision. So I will infer.
I will work on that with my nephew.
Okay, perfect,
He
good.
needs it. He needs some help.
Good. Thoughts? Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, do you know any instance that you pushed for the treatment and you realized that it's correct decision?
That it's correct or incorrect?
I mean, correct decision.
So,
The
for
patient-
instance, if I push someone to do aggressive care and they did aggressive care and it was a correct
Yeah.
decision?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that all the time. So, maybe I'm not understanding you because that was probably too simple for me to answer.
So, let me clarify. So
Give
you
me an
ask-
example. Give me an
Okay.
example.
So you ask the family or decision maker about the patient's status, and he or she decided to push for treatment.
Mhm.
Okay, so you do that, and the patient become better.
Mhm. So particularly if we're talking about someone who appears to be dying or appears to be at the end of
Yeah.
life, it is a minuscule minority of people who appear to have all the signs of dying who actually recover. And so, again, Americans, we're fighters. Everyone wants to be the exception. Everyone wants to be the miracle. I have seen those few, but I tell people we use the word miracle for a reason because it's extraordinarily rare. If everybody in Huntsville is praying for a miracle, you're not all going to get it, okay? You're going to be less than the 1% from whatever cause, okay? So by and large, if someone appears to be on a natural decline and we get aggressive, we might extend their dying process. Very rarely does someone go back and become who they used to be. We usually only extend the process of dying. Yes, sir.
And the reason you started this whole process a couple of years ago was basically for elderly end of life, and that's our primary focus.
Yes.
We don't
Yeah.
get into little kids and this and that. It's primarily basically saying we're all going to die. We should all be prepared or prepare those around us for that time.
Yes, and so related to that, one of the reasons I'm doing this is that I have to combat what you see on TV. On TV, if you fall over dead, we resuscitate you. And the stats are this, and these are real statistics based on a study. On TV, if you go into cardiac arrest, we are able to resuscitate you 75% of the time, and that you wake up and walk back into your normal life 67% of the time. That is a lie. 90% of people who are found dead stay dead. And if we resuscitate you from a fatal heart rhythm or from death, there's a 50% chance on average that you're never going to be who you used to be. And the older you are and the sicker you are, there's less than 1% chance. And then the question is, and I don't like to use the word futile, but is there any medical utility in that? Have I done anything to help you? Have I done anything to help you? So.
A couple of years ago, I did a chaplaincy training at the VA hospital. So
Yes.
by nature, 90% of the people in there are older and responding to code blues, which is, they come in and jump
Chest
on the bed
compressions
and do all
the
this
tube
kind
and
of
the
stuff.
shocks.
And then being in the intensive care unit, and so many of the people there, when you said that extending the dying, you're not keeping people alive. I mean, yes, they're alive, but it's really their death. And
Right.
it was heartbreaking to see these people hanging on, and sometimes those patients were in pain because there's only a certain level that you can medicate people, and they're still alive. Other than that, they're going to go.
Right.
If we all had more opportunity to see some of that.
To see, yeah.
I mean, it really
Firsthand
shifted
experience.
I've never had a problem with the whole dying process, but it really gave me a clearer vision
clearer
of what
view of
the
it.
extended dying.
Yes,
process
and part of that
is.
is in the intensive care unit, the doctor comes in and checks the blood pressure and checks the labs. So we're focusing on the subunits of the person, right? And so the doctor says, the blood pressure's good and the labs look better than yesterday. Well, duh, we can medically alter all of those. The big picture is, where is this patient going? Like my cousin. He was alive, he had a blood pressure, And the pulmonary doctor, the lung doctor said, well, his lungs are better than they were yesterday. He was never going to be who he used to be. And did he want that? Was that acceptable or not? So the big picture, we'll all end up in a medical facility one day, but when this comes up for you and your family, the question is, what's the big picture? What's the expected outcome? And with that knowledge, then you, if you're the medical decision maker, you focus on what that person would have wanted based on their big picture of life.
If you do want them to die at home, what can you do to assure that that will happen?
Okay, number one is you need to have open communications with your doctor that you want hospice when the time is appropriate. Hospice is home-based care for the last 6 months of life. You don't have to go back to the hospital, we bring the hospital to you. And the focus is not only on the physical comfort of the patient, but on the spouse, the entire family. And the focus of medicine and hospice is physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. And spiritual is just the sum total of our parts. It doesn't have to be religious. A chaplain will show up and cater to whatever spiritual faith you have or absence thereof to give you peace about the dying process. So your doctor needs to know you want hospice. You need to have a living will discussion and have it written out. And all of those people who will show up to make decisions for you need to hear from your mouth that I want to die at home, to the extent that it's possible. Now, in the next year and a half, we will have an inpatient hospice facility here in Huntsville. Huntsville Hospital and Hospice Family Care have joined to create that. And that will be a very peaceful and home-like setting for people who are actually too sick to die at home. There's just very rarely you can have symptoms so severe that you need an IV and 24-hour nursing care. That's just the minority. But should that occur, you can at least die in a home-like setting. Your family will be able to sleep with you. There'll be a kitchen. It's not going to be the sterile walls of a hospital room. But by and large, hospice is what enables you to die at home. And open conversations with your doctor so your doctor can say, you now fit hospice criteria. Let's make sure hospice comes to see you so that these last months are as good as they can be and your wish can be fulfilled to die at home. Does that help? Okay. Yes, sir.
Personal question, are you still working in emergency room
Huntsville Hospital.
full time?
Yes. This is my side gig. So there's been a consciousness change among physicians. I've been talking about this for 4 years. It's an issue in the nation. America is an aging country. You know, our average age is getting older and older, and 1,000 baby boomers a day turn 65. So this is in the public consciousness. It's an issue that we should be talking about as a community.
Well, all this gets the third-party insurers activated at some point. For example, for hospice, you have to have a code. Do you give a code?
There is a hospice code, yes. So Medicare, there's a Medicare benefit. Hospice is a Medicare benefit in the last 6 months of life. Most insurances cover hospice care. The vast majority do. But hospice care is available for the indigent population as well. There's a very small percentage of care provided by each hospice in town to people who cannot pay. So no one is turned away.
You have to justify for a code.
Okay,
So-
you have to qualify based on some very objective criteria, which are different based on each diagnosis, but the very general criteria are 20 pounds of weight loss, sleeping more, increasing pain, having trouble doing the activities of daily living, needing a lot of physical assistance by other people. And those are some very generic things. So those qualify you. The box has to be checked. Thank you all. Free books and the free tool in the back.
And she's available for your organizations.
Yeah, I can do this lecture or my second one, which is Preparing for Peace at the End of Life. It's more of a big picture, how we approach end of life as Americans.